Good evening. The topic of tonight's video is going to be why must great heroes suffer? This is going to be a philosophical analysis of Lord Byron's Giaour. I want to look at the metaphysics and the ethics that are implicit in his arguments. At face value, it does not seem like the Byronic hero should be a tragic character. The Byronic hero is, not to give any spoilers, but a figure of virtue, a figure of pride, of individualism. It seems almost contradictory that they should always be doomed to such a tragic end. So the fundamental questions I want to think about while going through this lecture is, why must the Byronic hero suffer? What is it about this universe that always leads them to suffering? Why is the Giaour a fatalistic tale? Despite anything else, despite the virtues, despite the qualities, despite the tale, even looking at other Byronic works, they always have this overwhelming sense of tragedy in a fatalistic sense, an unavoidable, inexorable sense. Why does the Giaour have no name? At no point is he referred to by a name, by anything that even resembles a personal comment, the Giaour itself being a derogatory term. Why must Layla have no dialogue? Despite being arguably the most impactful part of the entire poem, she herself has no individuality, no agency, and fundamentally no existence. This is a theme that is common with the Byronic hero. This is a theme that is common with Byron's writing in general, and furthermore, this is common throughout the Romantic school of thought. I've put a little star next to these fundamental questions so that hopefully when they come up, you'll be able to recognize them, although if I've done my job well, I think you'll recognize them far in advance. So, starting with Lord Byron, 1788 to 1824. He was a Romantic poet. Like all other Romantic poets, he was concerned with fundamental and universal questions. He was not concerned with portraying reality as it really is, as the naturalist school was. He wanted to talk about human values, about what it is that is most important and most concerning when we think about man on this earth. In that sense, the Romantic school were very Aristotelian, but certainly not in all senses. He travelled Europe extensively, which led a lot to the scene of this play. Many critics will describe it as kind of Oriental fetishization of the East. I think this is a very reductive view of what Byron presented, but nevertheless, it is a view you can take of this poem. Whilst I don't like particularly looking into authors and poets' private life, I think it is notable that he had a troubled romantic personal life. The values presented throughout the Giaour, if Byron lived by them, did not seem to work. They did not lead him to fruitful, long-lasting, monogamous relationships. Okay, so the Romantic school of thought in general began in the late 18th century through to the kind of mid-19th century. It was concerned with the timeless and fundamental questions about reality and mankind. As I juxtapose them with the naturalists, the Romanticists were concerned with showing things as they ought to be, as they could be, of taking a maximum account of mankind and portraying that, as opposed to just taking an average, taking a normal person with trivial problems. They were interested in grand themes and grand characters. They brought a unique emotional intensity, imagination, and excitement. The colour, the prose, the excitement and dynamism that is presented to the Romantic school of thought is really unlike anything else in literary history. You could take a look at the classicist school, who were so interested in distilling and boiling literature down to its core components that could just be recycled, that could be taken in a formulaic way. You would reproduce them and you would end up with, fundamentally boring and similar literature much of the time. the Romantics wanted to bring a unique flavour to literature. They took emotion as an irreducible primary. I am supposing anyone listening to this lecture has at least some idea of philosophy and literary terms. I could not go through every single thing in depth, else this video would be 100 hours long. But what I mean by an irreducible primary is they take emotion to be the starting point of their ethics and metaphysics. There is nothing that precedes emotion in the Byronic sense. Emotion is the starting point of our novel. Now, ironically, they are very often misclassified as an emotion-first school. If you hear any critic call them an emotion-first school, I would be very dubious of the rest of what they have to say. Fundamentally, the Romantics were value-first. Now, they had a conflation of emotion and value. However, it was never emotions that they were primarily concerned with. It was the values of human existence that they were concerned with. Emotions just so happened to be the perspective they took on it. Now, ironically, due to this conflation, they were very much a mystic school, and I'm hoping to reveal through this essay why this is ironic, why taking a value-first perspective is inherently precluding mysticism, despite them not having any formal philosophy. The Romantics were not able to recognize this issue in their premises. The Romantics rejected social convention. The Enlightenment was in full swing. You had many collectivists and rationalist philosophies of the time. They wanted to reject this. They wanted to stand against a rugged rationalist, a rugged collectivist. They wanted to reject this notion of you start with your geometric philosophical premises and you build from there. They wanted to start with what they saw as human qualities, to start with Romanticism, to start with dynamism, to start with emotion. They rejected all of these conventional contemporary frameworks in favour of a rugged individualism, of taking the maximum potential of humanity as it ought to be and portraying that, portraying heroic, larger-than-life figures. Moving on, what is the Byronic hero archetype? If I refer to a Byronic hero and its fundamental values, what does that mean? So the Byronic hero is generally a grand scale character, not necessarily in the social sense, as we will see in the Giaour or the picture of Heathcliff there. They were not socially large characters, they were not politicians or war generals. It is also common to have no plot and an overwhelming sense of tragedy. I've more or less taken that description from Ayn Rand, as I think it is very fitting for the Romantic school in general. There is kind of an oppressive sense of loss and pain all throughout Byron's poems. The Byronic hero is virtuous, he is heroic, he is individualist, he possesses a fantastic character, but is doomed to an extraordinary fate. He is inextricably linked to a painful ending full of misery, despite his virtuous character. It's a quote from the Giaour: "As meteor-like thou glidest by." These heroes are larger than life. They are not an average man. They are the greatest parts of man presented as an ought. So, the Byronic hero is a virtue based in emotional intensity. As we've seen with the Romantic school, they were primarily concerned with emotion and passion. And so, as for the Byronic hero, they too start and end with emotional intensity. They are generally a social outcast. They repudiate conventional social order. The Giaour himself, although I won't get into it at this point, he is against the culture of the time. He is an outcast. He is incongruous to his environment. It is necessary for the Byronic hero that they are virtuous in a culture that is not virtuous. Okay, moving on to the plot of the Giaour. This will be the briefest of looks possible at the plot. I highly recommend to anyone who hasn't read the Giaour, read it. It's about 40 pages and the poetics itself are absolutely marvellous. Despite some of the issues we will get into philosophically, the poem is thoroughly enjoyable. So the Giaour is set in a culture of political despotism and complete social erasure. The moral decay that is presented is extremely palpable. The culture is barbaric, it is not heroic, it is not virtuous, and it is shown all throughout the poem in the narrative structure. It is shown all throughout the poem in the descriptions and the characters. This is not a positive environment. This is not somewhere Byron saw as aspirational. So by the nature of the Byronic hero, they were aspirational in accordance to the environment they were in. They are the exact antithesis of the environment that Byron put them in. So the Giaour follows an unnamed Christian man, Giaour meaning infidel. He is not of the religion of the time. He has a forbidden affair with a Circassian woman called Layla. Layla is a member of Ottoman Lord Hassan's harem. After discovering the infidelity, Layla is put in a bag and drowned in the ocean. The Giaour, fueled by a passionate love, exacts revenge and kills Hassan. Unable to overcome the eternal strife, guilt, grief, he moves to a monastery and lives out to the end of his life in a solitude and misery. The majority of the end of the play goes to great lengths to show the internal misery, the internal decay that the Giaour goes through. So what can we see from the plot? What large themes can we see from the plot before taking any point-by-point analysis of it? Well, the basis of the Giaour's action is emotion. Love indeed is light from heaven. His primary action in the play, the killing of Lord Hassan, comes from his depth and wealth of love for Layla. It doesn't come, despite being a noble action, it doesn't come out from some internal feeling of nobility, some internal heroism. It comes purely from his love for Layla. The Giaour appears fatalistically bound, despite doing a noble action, despite having a fantastic and passionate love. He is unable to avoid this terrible end, this end that seems to chase him. There is a quote that says, "The shadows go over the rocks." It is like he is being hunted down by this horrible end that he cannot avoid. He is bound to fate. The Giaour undergoes a complete erasure of selfhood. I think this is very reflective in the nature of him moving to a monastery, a place where there is no great existential action. One does not go to a monastery to achieve great things in the world. One goes to a monastery for entirely internal reasons. So in this sense, the Giaour completely loses himself, and we will see why later. Now nothing left to love or hate, no more with hope or pride elate. In this quote, Byron demonstrates this lack of selfhood. The Giaour has no hope, he has no pride. Pride in this sense being the virtuous characteristics, an appreciation for his own activity, an appreciation for the things that he has created and the things that he has done. He now has nothing left. There is nothing to the Giaour that is notable. Now, admittedly, I was not sure at which point to order the next two, Byronic Metaphysics and the Giaour as a man. I've decided to proceed with Byronic Metaphysics because I think this will give us more of an insight into the Byronic universe, and this will allow us to place the characters, the characterization into the universe as opposed to deriving it from the characters. So we know emotion, as with all romantics, is at the heart of Byronic Metaphysics. What is an emotion? This will be my definition. I suspect it was not Lord Byron's definition, but nevertheless, I think it is paramount to how we interpret this poem going forward. So, an emotion is a reaction to a value judgment. Originally, the original value judgment, the one above anything else, is life or death. Will this choice sustain your organism, or will this choice doom your organism within the knowledge that you know? Let's take a simple example. Consider someone offers you a cherry pie or an apple pie. You might decide to choose the cherry pie because you prefer cherries, vice versa. This is a reaction to a value judgment. You'll feel happy at the cherry pie if you like the cherry pie. Likewise, you will feel happy with the apple pie if that is what you judge to be of more value to you. So value judgments themselves are not automatic. You were not born with some divisive appetite for cherry pie. These things are contextual. As man's knowledge develops, more values are discovered. Emotion acts in this sense as a barometer for the value. You're happy while you sit down and eat cherry pie. This tells you that you are doing something successful. You are moving closer to your value. If I took the cherry pie away, you would feel sad. So in this way, emotion gives you a proximity to whether you are achieving your value or not achieving your value. However, the values themselves, it is fundamental to remember, are not automatic. Whilst the emotion you feel might be automatic, the values you choose are not. So the Giaour has no explicit value judgment. At no point are we given anything that he explicitly has chosen. Emotion is treated as metaphysically primary to values. Now this is a complete inversion of the explanation I've just given you. Emotion cannot be fit to be the standard. Emotion can only tell you if you are close to your standard or not, but the standard itself must be rationally chosen. Emotion could never tell you whether the standard itself is appropriate, because emotion is derivative of the standard itself. It's a reaction to the values. It cannot be the values. So, given that the Giaour's value is emotion, that means we know he has no rational, explicit, chosen value judgment. In other words, all of his values are intrinsic. They are inherited by culture. They are inherited by the time. They are unexamined, and so his emotion is an automatic response. He is living fatalistically. He is living off arbitrary whim and, ironically, off social convention. He is not choosing the actions he wishes to take because he has not chosen the things that he values. He happens to value things, and he happens to value emotion, so he does what his emotion tells him. But at no point is there a rational, goal-directed action. And so now we can start to get an idea, well, why does the Byronic hero live fatalistically? There you go, we have a start. We've answered one of our fundamental questions. He lives fatalistically because he has no choice. He is determined by arbitrary whim of how he feels in any given moment. So, why must suffering be inherent in fatalism? At this point, you could say to me, well, okay, that's fair enough. Sure, we can agree the Byronic hero lives fatalistically. But why must the Byronic hero suffer? Just because he lives fatalistically doesn't mean he has to suffer. Well, actually, it does. Any deviation from a rational ideal serves to dispossess man of his mental faculty. If rationality is the way that we choose values, then taking away the capacity to choose values by living fatalistically means that you are unable to choose your values. You are unable to move forward in a rational direction. And if you can't move forward in a rational direction, everything you do is essentially a lottery. You have absolutely no hope of moving towards a positive or virtuous life. Everything you do is entirely arbitrary. Here's a quote from Byron: "For my soul is fleeting towards the final goal." Clearly, he has no agency. He has no power over his end. He has no power over his means. He is simply just floating around. He is just occupying this space in the world, waiting to eventually die. Now, I want to make a quick note on the narrative structure because I also wasn't sure exactly where to include this. Might have been better to put in with the plot, but nevertheless. So the narrative structure is told from multiple narratorial voices. The poem itself is extremely fragmented. It is not told in a chronological or narrative order as such. I think this just further goes to demonstrate the fact that the Giaour is not in control of his own life. He is not even in control of his own story. The tale is told almost exclusively from the perspective of other people. He has no agency over his life existentially, and he has absolutely no agency of how people perceive his life. So, onto the Giaour as a man, or in other words, we've gone through plot, we've gone through philosophy, and now we're going through characterization. We've figured out our philosophy based on context and the things that are intrinsic in the plot. Now we are able to apply that philosophy that seems so unavoidable in Byronic works, and now we can apply it to the Giaour as a character, and we can understand in a deeper lens the events that occur throughout the poem. So without Layla, he is clearly lost. She was my life's unerring light that quenched what beam shall break my night. He is incapable of finding the actions that are most beneficial to him without Layla. Layla acted almost as a proxy virtue. As long as she was alive, he had at least some idea of what he valued. He had some idea of what to go towards. In that sense, I would not call Layla a rational value, but it at least stood as some value. Without her, his life is entirely at the mercy of arbitrary whim. It is emotion by emotion, day by day. There is no broad existential feeling of achievement or feeling of direction. So in this way, the Giaour is completely severed from life. Rationality determines your values. Byronic heroes are entirely irrational and so are subject to just a miserable world, devoid of any flourishing, devoid of the capacity to chase their values, devoid of the capacity to even know what their values are. The Byronic hero is absolutely helpless to this fatalistic torture. Nor ear can hear, nor tongue can tell the tortures of that inward hell. The Byronic hero suffers fatalistically, suffers necessarily from the basis of his values, or really lack thereof. So, the tragedy of the Byronic hero is a lack of capacity to live consciously in reality, the lack of capacity to choose, the lack of capacity to understand their values, to live virtuously, to have goal-oriented actions and to fulfill them. So, now we've answered two of our fundamental questions. Why must the Byronic hero live fatalistically, and why must the Byronic hero suffer? Fundamentally, what we can see about the Byronic hero above all else is that it is suffering from emotion, or it is suffering from misplaced emotion with no foundation. And this brings me back to my comment on the Romantic school of having no explicit philosophical tendencies. They chose emotion as a starting point as they felt culture was far too rational, and they essentially just ran with it with no real further introspection. So we can finally return to our former two of our four primary questions. So on Layla's speech, given everything we've learned, what could we say about Layla if she was an individual? If Layla was truly a person, that would not at all fit the direction of this poem as we have analysed it. If Layla was a person, she would have some kind of agency. She would have some kind of action throughout the poem. She would have an impact on the shaping of the poem, and yet she doesn't. At no point does she have any real agency, much the same as the Byronic hero does not. She is the true personification of the primacy of emotion. She just exists as a device to show how helpless the Byronic hero is. Now, was Byron himself actually aware of the function of Layla, or was he just perhaps misogynistic, as many critics might say? It is impossible to know explicitly. We do not have any interviews from Byron on this fact. We do not have anything to refer to. All we can say is that Layla's function in this poem is perfectly in line with everything that we know about Byronic metaphysics. So then on the Giaour, he goes through an entire loss of selfhood. What is selfhood? Selfhood is the knowledge primarily of who you are and what you want to do. The Giaour has absolutely no rational basis for what he wants to do. As we've observed, he is just floating. He is just passing through the world, with no goals, with no real ends. And even if he had ends, he does not have the means to achieve them because they are not chosen rationally. So the lack of the Giaour's name exacerbates his loss as a person. He is simply just the Giaour. He is simply just a part of this environment, a part of this social structure. He himself is not an individual with the capacity to chase his ends, to fulfill his life, to reach achievement and flourishing in this world. So then we can say the Byronic universe appears fundamentally malevolent. A world in which there can be no value, a world in which even if you had value, it has no existential power because you don't know how you got your values. You don't know how you got your values, you can't achieve them, and so reality is completely unintelligible. You cannot apply your mind, your sole function of connecting with the world, you cannot apply it to reality at all. And so the Byronic universe is malevolent. You are left out in the dark, you are left in the cold with no clothes and no tools to defend yourself. Man is completely severed from the one function that allows him to survive in this world. Evolutionary, man's power has been his cognition. It is what man has developed to survive and to thrive in this world. If you take the cognition away from man, if you treat man like an animal that is only based on emotion, he has no other function other than his emotion, you take that as the starting point, the world will always appear malevolent. The world will always appear heinous to man. It will appear as though the world itself is not fit for man to survive in, despite man having evolved from that world. So now I want to take a quick foray into what the opposite would look like, what a benevolent universe would appear as. Now, to those of you who were just interested in the Byron section, that has ended now. However, this is still vastly applicable metaphysically to what we have seen presented in Byron. And it's extremely important to go through this to understand what it was that we saw in the poem. We've identified the problem, but we might not have truly identified why it is a problem. So if we take Byron as a malevolent universe, what would the benevolent universe look like? It would be a world that rewards value. It would be a world that inspires flourishing. Your values would be rationally chosen. They would be cognitively chosen. You would be able to connect with the world using your mind and choose your values based on what you think is consciously best for you. It is a world that is understandable to man. Your values are chosen rationally. They're chosen consciously. And so they are chosen of this world for this world. Man does not have any other way to get virtue, and with that understanding, it is not a surprise that the Romantics were mystics. If you can't choose your values of this world, you might as well choose them from somewhere that is not this world. But parenthetically, I want to add that this world is the only world. Any value you choose must be a value of this world, for this world. If man is to have any hope at all of accomplishing anything, of living a happy life, of flourishing, he must choose his values so that they are in accordance with the one world that we live in. So, to look at Howard Roark, the protagonist in Ayn Rand's Fountainhead. Roark serves a fundamentally different aesthetic function than the Giaour. The Giaour served the function of demonstrating emotion. He demonstrated what the Romanticist school would look like. However, Roark is a summation of Rand's entire philosophy, a philosophy that is explicit, unlike the Romanticists. You could say, in many ways, the Giaour represents Byron and Roark represents philosophy. Roark's values are rationally derived. Value is not dependent on whim nor arbitrary emotion. It does not begin with your passion as its premise. It begins with value and rationality as its premise, and emotions are derived in response to your value. Emotion serves the point of bringing you closer to your virtues, not as choosing your virtues. So, his value is for this world. It is of this world, from this world, and it corresponds only to this world. That means Roark can live in this world knowing that his values are appropriately chosen and will bring him closer to a flourishing and happy life. Roark's love begins at an individual level. We can see his love with Dominique is still fantastically passionate, wondrously filled with a wealth of descriptive and romantic vocabulary, much as the Romanticists do. However, that love is not chosen with love as its primary. Love is not the most important part of his love. The most important part of his love is the recognition that Roark and Dominique are individuals. They have their own lives, they have their own values, and love is the recognition of how much they care for each other's values. Roark did not look to Dominique and say, I'm so passionately in love, but I don't know why. I can't recognize your virtues were not chosen by you. It is essentially a lucky dip. You just so happen to have some virtues that you gathered from wherever. You didn't choose them, and it just so happens that I value those virtues. For Roark, he says, I understand my virtues. I understand the virtues that are necessary to human life, and Dominique, you have those. And that is why Roark's love is so passionate in the Romanticist sense, and that is why we would call Rand's work romantic realism. So the world is intelligible to Roark. The nature of virtue necessitates it be so. The place that he has derived his virtues from are of this world, and so the world must be intelligible. For the Randian hero, benevolence is guaranteed. You found your values, you found cognitively that they are of this world, and you have found rationally that they are fit for this world and fit for humans. It is only guaranteed that benevolence will be the end result. If you have your values and your values are good and you have the capacity, you have the means to achieve your values, of course the world appears benevolent to Roark and malevolent to the Giaour. And so, what are you left with? You have finished the Giaour, you are filled with a sense of pessimism that you can't quite describe, a sense of raw, emotional, Byronic pessimism. Byron's sense of life was truly that man is inherently doomed. And this is not unique to Byron by any sense. You can feel free to read St. Augustine or really any number of modern literati. Man is doomed, man is damned, there is no hope. You can be as virtuous as you want, as heroic. Even if you take the best parts of man, you will always end up with a necessary tragedy. You are filled as a reader with a sense of hopelessness. What happens after you finish the Fountainhead? You understand implicitly and rationally what your virtues should be, and that these virtues are fit for man. And if you achieve these virtues, you will have happiness and flourishing. You are filled with a sense of rational benevolence and optimism towards yourself and the universe. You have the knowledge that you can achieve anything that you want out of life. You have the knowledge you can go out and you can apply your means to your desired ends, and you can come away with it with a fulfilling life full of flourishment and wealth. And so, there is no better example than the feeling a reader may get. So I take that as my proof that the Byronic universe is not fit for man and is not fit for the reader. Now, I will add, again parenthetically, Byron was a fantastic poet. His writing is full of dramatic and imaginative splendour. Had it not been for Byron, romantic realism may not exist. It is important to read these works that are available, and it is even more important to read them rationally and consciously so you can understand the flaws with them and not make the flaws in your own personal life. Literature is a representation of how man should live at its best. You cannot take literature as some arbitrary, aesthetic, emotional, viscous representation. If you are to read literature, you are to read literature for the point of applying it to life. When an artist creates a piece of work, when an author writes a book, they are selectively recreating the parts of reality they find fundamentally important. And so you cannot just say that literature is empty, it is purely for entertainment, because it is not for the author. Whether they recognize it or not, the author is representing the things they find important, the things that they believe. And so the literature that you should create, the literature that you should absorb and critique and understand and feel connected to, is the literature that represents the values that are important to you. And that more or less brings the lecture to a close. Here is some additional reading for the topics I went through. Ayn Rand's Romantic Manifesto and Aristotle's Poetics are an absolute wealth of literary knowledge. They will truly put into perspective any work that you read. I think reading without some kind of philosophical framework, whether it be a correct one or not, is somewhat like groping around in the dark and just hoping that you'll stumble upon something fitting for the book. And of course, Lord Byron's The Giaour, and I probably should have added onto here as well, The Fountainhead. Despite it being a significantly longer read than the other three works here, it is marvellous, it is pro-life, it is full of vivid, affluent imagery, and I would recommend it to anyone who cares about their life on this earth and only this earth. Thank you all for watching this lecture. I hope I have imparted some information. I would like eventually, when these lectures get enough views, that I'll be able to answer questions in the comment section in the next lectures. So this will be your opportunity to go down and comment any questions or any disagreements you have with the points I have presented. I hope you all have learned something important that you can take away in a literary sense and in a personal sense and apply it to your daily lives and the literature that you will read in the future. Have a fantastic day.